Story 1. The key I never took back. I didn't understand what was happening the first few times because nothing was missing. That's the part that still gets under my skin. If somebody breaks into your apartment, you expect the obvious stuff. A window cracked open, a drawer dumped out, a lock scratched up. But what I had were tiny changes. The kind you can explain away if you want your life to stay normal, and I really wanted mine to stay normal. I thought the worst part of that relationship was already over. I thought once he moved out, once the apartment went quiet again, once I could hear my own refrigerator humming at night without hearing his voice over it, that meant I was safe. I was wrong about when it ended. My name's Mara. And a couple years ago, I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on East Pike Street in Seattle, up on the 3rd floor above a nail salon and a place that sold expensive soap. I was 29 then, working regular hours for a marketing firm downtown, taking the bus in the morning with the same stainless steel travel mug and the same blue backpack I'd had since college. The apartment wasn't big, but after the breakup it started feeling like mine again. I liked that. The windows faced another building, so the light came in soft and gray even on clear days. The refrigerator had this constant low hum that blended into the place so completely I only noticed it when the power flickered. I kept a basil plant on the sill that shouldn't have survived Seattle winter light but somehow did. I washed my sheets every Sunday, used the same clean linen detergent, and by the time I got home from work the apartment always smelled faintly like that and dust-warm. Baseboard heat. Quiet. Predictable. Mine. I'd given Nolan a spare key months before we broke up, back when we were still doing ordinary couple things like feeding each other's cat that neither of us actually owned, because we both wanted one and never got one. After the breakup, I kept meaning to ask for it back, or change the locks, or at least make a point of it. I never did. There wasn't one dramatic reason. It was more embarrassing than that. He said he'd look for it. Then he said it might be in an old jacket. Then weeks passed, and I figured if he wanted to make my life hard, he would have done it already. I told myself not every loose end is a threat. Sometimes it's just a loose end. The first thing I noticed was the chair by the kitchen counter. I had this cheap wooden chair I'd found on the curb and painted a soft green because the original finish looked like wet cardboard. I never sat in it. I used it to drop my bag or drape a sweater over. One Tuesday night in early December, I came home just after 7. Kicked off my boots by the door, and saw the chair angled slightly toward the hallway instead of tucked under the counter, not pulled out all the way, just off, maybe a few inches. The right front leg wasn't lined up with the scuff mark on the floor where it usually sat. I remember standing there with my keys still in my hand, staring at it longer than a chair deserved. Then I laughed a little at myself. Not because it was funny, but because I was already embarrassed by how fast my brain had jumped. I lived alone. I moved things around all the time without noticing. I'd probably bumped it leaving for work. I was tired. It was dark by 4:30 that time of year, and I hadn't eaten since noon except for almonds from the office kitchen that tasted like printer paper from sitting in a plastic tub too long. So I nudged the chair back with my foot, hung my coat up, and kept going. Still, when I heated leftovers later, I caught myself looking over at it again. It wasn't the last small thing. 2 days later, I opened a carton of oat milk for coffee and got that weird immediate hesitation people get when something looks familiar but not right. The plastic seal under the cap had already been peeled back. Not fully off, just broke. I stood there in the kitchen in my socks, the counter cold against my hip, and tried to remember if I'd opened it the night before and forgotten. I must have, I decided. I was bad about that kind of thing when I was distracted. I poured it into my coffee anyway. The next morning there was less orange juice than I remembered too. Not enough to prove anything. Just enough to make me hold the carton up to the light from the stove and feel stupid doing it. I rationalized each thing as it came. That was my reflex then. I liked the kind explanation, the harmless explanation. If a bottle looked moved, I assumed I'd been rushed. If a cabinet stood half an inch open, I assumed I hadn't shut it properly. If the blanket on my couch was folded differently, I assumed I'd done it while half asleep during a streaming binge and had no memory of it because who remembers folding a blanket? That was how I got through those first weeks after Nolan left too, by interpreting things generously. The silence meant peace, not abandonment. The empty closet meant space, not loss. The spare key I never got back meant laziness, not access. By mid-December, I had started noticing personal things out of place. My hairbrush would turn up on the bathroom sink when I knew I'd left it in the top drawer because I hated seeing loose hair sitting out. My phone charger would be looped neatly on the coffee table instead of hanging over the arm of the couch where I always left it plugged in. A book I was halfway through would have the bookmark tucked in 10 pages earlier than where I'd stopped. Not enough to make me think somebody was reading it. More like somebody had picked it up and tried to put it back the way they found it, then guessed wrong. That should have been enough. I know that now. At the time, I kept reaching for the kindest explanation. Stress, bad sleep, muscle memory. I'd had a rough month and a half. My routines were back, but not fully. I was still learning what alone felt like again. Maybe I was less observant than I thought. Maybe I was doing everything on autopilot and then blaming the apartment for my own inattention. I actually felt better once I put words to it like that. I remember washing a cereal bowl and thinking, there, that's all this is. You're adjusting. It's not sinister for your own home to feel unfamiliar after someone else lived in it with you for 2 years. Of course, things still had a trace of him, and that didn't mean he was still there. What I didn't say out loud was that the apartment didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt watched, not all the time, just in brief moments, usually late when I was brushing my teeth or changing into a t-shirt to sleep. I would get this strange sense that I had interrupted something private by walking into my own room. Then the feeling would pass and I'd be annoyed at myself for turning ordinary loneliness into drama. A week before Christmas, I came home from work and found the shower floor damp. Not soaked, not obviously used. Just damp enough that when I stepped into the bathroom in my tights, the cool moisture transferred through the fabric at my knees when I leaned down to grab a towel off the lower shelf. I straightened up fast and stared at the glass door. There were no fresh streaks on it. The mirror wasn't fogged. The towels were where I'd left them. But the tile inside the shower had that darkened look grout gets when it's still holding water. I stood there, listening. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Pipes clicked somewhere in the wall. Down on the street, a bus exhaled at a stop and pulled away. Normal city sounds, normal apartment sound. I checked the faucet. No drip. I touched the shower knob to see if maybe it had leaked. Dry. I even crouched and ran my fingertips along the metal track at the bottom of the door. Wet. I remember saying to nobody maybe maintenance came in. The second it left my mouth, I knew that didn't make sense. Management had to give notice unless there was an emergency. And there was no email, no slip under the door, nothing. Also, why would maintenance use my shower? I laughed again, but quieter that time. Then I told myself maybe I'd showered that morning while half asleep and forgotten how wet I'd left it, which wasn't true. I showered at night. Always. It was part of the routine I liked because it made the apartment smell like steam and soap and clean cotton right before bed. That night I checked the deadbolt twice before getting into bed. The act of checking it made me feel dramatic, which made me irritated, which weirdly helped. Irritation is easier to sit with than fear. I slept badly anyway. Every settling noise in the building seemed louder than usual. The heater clicked on and I opened my eyes. Somebody upstairs dropped something heavy and I rolled over. At some point just before dawn, I dreamed somebody was standing in the hall outside my bedroom, not moving, only listening, and when I woke up my throat felt dry and tight like I'd been breathing through my mouth. The next evening I bought one of those little magnetic contact alarms for the front door and then didn't install it because doing that would mean admitting I thought there was a reason to. That's what I mean when I say I was optimistic. I didn't just hope for the best. I actively protected it. I protected the possibility that nothing was wrong. Because once you stop doing that, your life changes shape around the fear. Over the next week, the wrongness got harder to keep in the harmless category. A yogurt cup I knew I hadn't touched was missing its foil lid. My laundry basket, which I always kept beside the bedroom closet, turned up in the bathroom one morning with one of my work blouses folded over the edge like I'd been choosing outfits in there. My winter scarf, the green one with one loose thread hanging near the end, was on the hook by the door in a loop I never used. The apartment itself looked the same. Nothing wrecked, nothing stolen. But my habits were being imitated back at me in these near misses that made me feel oddly intimate with a person I couldn't see. One Friday I came home early because the office internet went down. It was just after 3. Still gray outside, the kind of Seattle afternoon that feels like the sky gave up halfway through the day. When I unlocked the apartment, the smell hit me first. Laundry detergent, yes, but stronger than usual. Almost fresh, as if someone had opened the bottle or wiped something down with a shirt straight out of the wash. Under it there was another smell too. Warm dust and something sour, faint but human. I stood just inside the door and listened hard enough that my ears actually started to ache. No movement. No footsteps, nothing except the refrigerator and the distant whoosh of cars on wet pavement outside. I told myself if somebody had been in there, they were already gone. Then I hated that I was even using the phrase "if somebody." That was the moment I finally did something instead of thinking. I checked every room, which took maybe 40 seconds because there wasn't much to check. Closet, under the bed. Shower, behind the shower curtain even though it was glass, kitchen nook, the little coat closet by the door. Empty. But in the bedroom my jewelry dish was on the wrong side of the dresser. It was a shallow ceramic thing shaped like a moon. I always kept it on the left because the lamp cord came down on the right and I hated cluttering it. Someone had moved it right across the wood, leaving a curved, dustless trail under where it had been. I touched the dish and my fingers came away with a little grit from the dresser top that should have been under it. That wasn't memory. That was evidence. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, trying to decide who to call. The building manager seemed reasonable in theory, but what was I going to say? "Hi. I think someone is entering my apartment and doing incredibly subtle things to make me feel crazy. Can you help?" I could already hear how it would sound. My best friend Lena would believe me emotionally but also tell me to leave and call the police. And I wasn't ready for the police because I still didn't have a broken lock or a missing laptop or a man standing in front of me holding a knife. I had repositioned domesticity. I had used yogurt. So I did the most useless thing possible. I texted Nolan, "Hey, weird question. Do you still have my spare key?" He responded 15 minutes later. Thought I lost it. Why? Even reading that now, I don't know if the answer is worse if it was true. I typed and erased a dozen versions before sending, just trying to make sure. Things have felt off in here lately. He sent back a laughing emoji first, then probably you being haunted by your own mess. That annoyed me enough that I almost felt normal. Nolan had always used humor like a dodge. If something serious got too close, he'd make it smaller. Familiar irritation is comforting. It makes a person seem ordinary. I told myself that response was exactly why this wasn't him. If he were doing something, he wouldn't draw attention to the key. He'd deny having it, not joke. See how easy it was for me. I found another generous explanation and climbed right into it. That night I wedged a chair under the front doorknob, even though the chair was too light to do anything except make noise if the door opened. Then I felt ridiculous again and kicked it away before bed because I didn't want to wake up and hate myself for acting paranoid. I woke just after 2 in the morning with the kind of sharp, complete alertness that means something pulled you out of sleep all at once. No gradual surfacing, just awake. The bedroom was dark except for the soft orange spill of streetlight through the blind. I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen and the little ticking rattle my vent made when the heat turned on. My mouth tasted stale, and for a second I didn't know what had woken me. Then I saw it. A line of pale light stretched across the hallway carpet. The bathroom light was on. I never left that light on at night, ever. It bothered me. Too bright, too cold. The bulb in there was one of those harsh white ones that made the whole room look like a clinic. I was obsessive about turning it off before bed because I could see the edge of it from my pillow if the bedroom door was open. The bathroom door was mostly closed but not latched, just slightly ajar, enough for the light to spill through in a narrow blade across the floor. I pushed myself up slowly onto my elbows, staring at that strip of light. My body hadn't caught up yet. I was still trying to place which version of reality I was in. Maybe I got up to pee and forgot. Maybe I left it on by accident. Maybe the door shifted with a draft. Then a shadow moved behind the door, not across the opening, behind it. A change in shape, a human-sized darkening of the light as something shifted weight without stepping out. I stopped breathing. I don't mean that dramatically. I literally forgot to inhale. My chest just held still. There was no sound. That was the part that made it worse. No foot scrape, no fabric rustle, no breath. Just the light and the shadow changing inside it. My phone was on the nightstand. I reached for it too fast and knocked it to the floor. The sound was tiny, just plastic tapping hardwood, but the shadow behind the door stopped moving. Then I heard one thing, a soft click, like a fingernail touching ceramic. The toothbrush cup. It was on the sink. I knew that sound because I'd made it myself 100 times. My hands were shaking so badly I had to use both of them to grab the phone off the floor. I didn't call the police. I wish I could tell you I did the smart thing, but I wasn't thinking in a straight line. All I knew was there was someone in the bathroom of my apartment within 10 feet of my bed, and the bedroom door opened outward into the hall, which meant if I got up and they came out at the same time, we'd be right there on top of each other. I slid off the far side of the bed away from the doorway, keeping my eyes on that strip of light the whole time. My knees almost gave out when my feet hit the rug. I grabbed my coat from the chair, not because I needed it, but because doing something normal kept me moving. And then I went for the window. 3rd floor. Fire escape. I'd never used it. I didn't even know if it would open cleanly. The window stuck in wet weather, and Seattle in December is all wet weather. My fingers slipped on the latch twice because my palms were slick. Behind me, still no sound from the bathroom. That silence felt deliberate, like whoever was in there knew exactly what I was hearing, or not hearing. The window finally jerked up with a wooden groan that sounded so loud I flinched. Cold air shoved in at once, damp and metallic. I got one leg over the sill, then the other, scraping my shin on the frame hard enough to feel heat under the skin. The fire escape stairs were black with rain and slick under my socks. I almost fell getting onto them. Only then, hanging onto the railing with both hands, did I look back. From the alley side, I could see into part of my apartment through the bedroom window and the sliver of hall. The bathroom light was still on. The door opened a little wider, not fast, just enough. A hand touched the edge of it. I couldn't see the face, only the side of a shoulder and the hand. Loose on the door like whoever it belonged to was in no hurry at all. I climbed down barefoot in my sleep shirt and coat and stood in the alley behind the building, shaking so hard my teeth clicked together. The concrete smelled like rainwater and old garbage and engine oil. My phone screen kept slipping under my thumb when I finally managed to call 911. By the time officers came and went through the apartment with flashlights, there was no one there. Of course there wasn't. The bathroom light was off again. The shower was dry. Nothing appeared forced. The officer who spoke to me was kind, but I could feel the distance in his voice. He asked about the breakup as gently as he could. Asked if Nolan had ever threatened. Asked if I might have left the light on and panicked after waking up. I said I saw a hand. He nodded like that mattered and didn't quite say whether he believed me. I didn't go back inside alone that night. Lena came and got me, and I spent 3 nights on her couch with my apartment keys sitting in a bowl by the door like they belonged to somebody who had died. When I eventually returned in daylight with my building manager, nothing big was missing. Not jewelry, not my laptop, not cash. But the things that had been touched started standing out everywhere once I stopped trying to be kind about it. My pillowcase smelled faintly of detergent on one side and somebody else's shampoo on the other. A sweater in my closet had one sleeve turned inward as if someone had taken it off in a hurry and corrected it halfway. The spare blanket in the hall closet was folded wrong, too tight, hotel style. And in the bathroom trash under tissues and cotton pads there was a used strip from one of my throat lozenges. I hadn't been sick. I never stayed there overnight again. I went back in daylight for clothes, documents, the plant, the boring pieces of my life. I signed paperwork to break the lease early and found another place across town by February. My body adjusted before my mind did. For months, any time I woke in the dark and saw a line of light under a door, my throat would lock up so hard I couldn't swallow right. I started sleeping with my phone under the pillow, which made it overheat, and I still didn't stop. I never got proof in the clean way people want. Nolan denied ever coming back. The building manager said there was no sign of entry. The police report existed, but it sat there thin and unsatisfying, just a record of my fear with no conclusion attached to it. I moved out. Life kept going. That's what makes this kind of thing so ugly. It doesn't end with tape around a doorway. Sometimes it just thins out and sinks into the walls of your next life. The day I moved the last box out, I did one final walkthrough of the apartment. Empty rooms, gray light, refrigerator already gone, so the place was strangely silent without that hum. My footsteps sounded wrong in there without furniture. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the hall closet, everything bare. Then I saw the key hook by the door. When Nolan moved out, I'd taken my spare key off that hook and dropped it in the junk drawer beside the stove because I couldn't decide what to do with it. I remember doing it. I remember the little metal click against a roll of tape and a packet of soy sauce from takeout. But on moving day, the spare key was hanging on the hook again, turned slightly toward the wall the way it always had when he used to grab it on his way out. I stood there with my empty apartment behind me, and my hand around my own key so tightly the edge bit into my palm. And what I still can't answer is whether whoever had been inside put it back because they wanted me to know the story wasn't finished, or because from their side of it, they never thought they'd left at all. I quit telling myself it was stress after that. I quit telling myself optimism is the same as strength. It isn't. Sometimes it's just a prettier way to stay in danger. Even now, in a different apartment with different locks and different windows, I still can't leave a spare key in the open. Mine stays wrapped in painter's tape inside a coffee tin on the top shelf of my kitchen cabinet. And every time I move before I unpack anything else, I check the hooks by the door to make sure there's nothing already hanging there. I know some people hear stories like this and want the answer so they can put it away neatly. Was it Nolan? Was it a stranger? Was it somebody in building maintenance? I don't have that for you. What I have is smaller and worse. I have a bathroom light that turned itself into a line on the carpet. I have a hand on the edge of a door. I have the memory of standing in an empty apartment on moving day, hearing nothing at all and still feeling like I had interrupted somebody by coming in. The next one is about messages instead of room, but the feeling underneath it is the same. That private, sickening moment when you realize something has been using your life while you were still in it. Story 2. Messages I don't remember sending. I didn't get scared when the first messages showed up. I got embarrassed. That's important, because if I'd been scared immediately, I probably would have left sooner. But embarrassment makes you stay quiet. It makes you assume the problem is you. And when you're already trying to prove to yourself you can live in a place without feeling weird about every sound, you get very good at swallowing that first bad instinct. I thought my phone was glitching. Then I thought maybe I was tired enough to send things and forget. It took a while for the worst part to come together, and by then every normal little thing I'd ignored had started fitting into a shape I still hate thinking about. My name's Keelan. I was 23, finishing my last year of community college in Austin and working afternoon shifts at a coffee shop off South Lamar. I moved into my partner Jules' old apartment because they insisted it made practical sense. The lease was cheap for the area, the bus route to campus was direct, and they were staying with a friend more and more anyway, so it felt like one of those grown-up compromises people brag about. The building was on a side street just east of downtown, one of those faded brick places where the stair rails were always warm from the sun and the hall smelled like old paint and somebody's dinner. Inside, the apartment had stale air and this lingering perfume scent that had sunk into the curtains and bedroom closet. Jules said it was probably from the woman who'd lived there before them. I believed that because I wanted to. I was never good at being alone, and moving into a place that had already belonged to someone I loved made it feel less empty. There were still some of Jules's things there when I moved in: a chipped cereal bowl, a stack of old mail rubber banded in a kitchen drawer, a couple shirts left on purpose in the closet because they'd said they'd pick them up eventually. The apartment felt borrowed for the first week, but not in a threatening way. More like I was settling into a shape somebody else had already made. I unpacked my books, lined up my mugs, set my phone charger by the bed. Outside the windows I could hear distant traffic at almost every hour. That soft city rush that never fully stops. It helped at night. Silence would have been worse. The first wrong thing happened on a Monday evening while I was sitting on the floor eating pad thai out of the carton because I still hadn't assembled my kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know. It said, "You don't have to keep pretending you don't hear it." I stared at it for a second. Then another message came in. "If you're in the bedroom, look at the vent." My stomach went tight, but mostly because I thought somebody had sent it to the wrong person. Then I opened the thread and saw 2 messages above theirs that I definitely didn't remember sending. The first said, "It's louder tonight." The second said, "What does it want me to do?" I just sat there with my fork in my hand rereading them. I checked the timestamp. Just after 6. I had been steaming milk for somebody who wanted exactly 4 pumps of vanilla and a dry cappuccino at that time. I knew because she'd complained. There was no way I'd sent those messages then. My immediate explanation was stupid, but it felt useful. Pocket texting. Voice to text going off by accident. Maybe my phone was open in my apron and typing nonsense. I told myself that made sense because the messages were weird and vague and exactly the kind of thing a phone might create if fabric brushed the keyboard. Still, I got up and looked at the bedroom vent. Nothing. Just dust around the slats and a little dark space beyond. The air smelled faintly of old drywall and perfume, same as always. I texted back, "Sorry, wrong number." The response came almost immediately. "You used to know me better than that." I laughed in this short, breathless way I do when I'm uncomfortable and trying not to admit it. Then I took a screenshot and sent it to Jules with "some random creep." They answered 10 minutes later with "Austin is full of weirdos, block it." So I blocked the number. Problem solved, I thought. Weird, but solved. That would have been the end of it if it had stayed one thread. It didn't. Over the next few days, I noticed other replies from other unknown contacts, always in message threads I didn't remember starting. Some were short. "Still here? You moved the chair. Don't tell me you forgot again." One person just sent, "Stop sending pictures unless you want me involved." Every time I opened one, there were outgoing messages above it from my number. Whole lines, whole conversations, not gibberish either. Specific, coherent stuff that sounded sort of like me if I was upset, but wrong in the details. They mentioned the hallway light flickering, the bathroom sink running by itself, somebody standing in the kitchen doorway and leaving when I turned around. I did what anxious people do when they want to stay functional. I built explanations as fast as the evidence arrived. Maybe my phone had been synced to an old tablet. Maybe Jules still had some account access. Maybe some backup restore had dragged in deleted texts from years ago. Phones do weird things. Apps do weird things. I kept telling myself modern life is held together by glitches and permissions and invisible little failures. That was easier than admitting the messages seemed current. Worse, they seemed aware of the apartment in ways that matched where I was living now. One night after closing shift, I got home around midnight and found my phone warm on the dresser. Not charging, just warm, like it'd been in somebody's hand for a while. I looked at the battery usage screen. Messages had been active 15 minutes earlier. I hadn't touched the phone since leaving work. I remember standing in my room with my backpack still on. The perfume smell in the apartment suddenly too sweet, too present, and trying to decide if heat meant anything at all. Phones get warm, that's normal. A background update maybe, some app refreshing. I could hear music from somebody's car at the curb below and the ticking buzz of the bathroom fan I'd left on to clear shower steam. Ordinary sounds. I used them to stay grounded. Then I opened messages and saw a sent text from 6 minutes earlier. "I'm in the bedroom now. It's closer when you're gone." Attached under it was no image, just an empty gray box like something had failed to send. I called Jules right away. They sounded sleepy and annoyed. I explained too fast, talking over myself. "Maybe it came from the cloud. Maybe something synced. Can you just check if any of your old devices are still logged in?" Jules sighed and said, "I haven't lived there in months, Keelan. Reset your phone. It'll be fine." It would have been comforting if they had sounded more surprised. The next day, between classes, I sat in the student union and started going through everything like I was doing an audit. I changed my passwords, I logged out of all active sessions, I turned off message forwarding, deleted old apps, checked my carrier account, updated my phone, restarted it twice. For a few hours, nothing happened. That false quiet almost worked on me. I even felt a little ashamed for how spun up I'd gotten. That night, another thread appeared. This one had my name in it. "You always did this, Keelan. You make it sound like the room is the problem." My scalp prickled in this very physical way, like my skin had tightened. I scrolled up. My number had sent 3 messages earlier that afternoon. The first said, "Did you ever sit in the hallway outside the bedroom and listen?" The second said, "I think it likes when I answer." The third was just my own full name. I called the number from the thread. It went straight to voicemail. No name, no greeting, just a long silence and then a click. By then I wasn't just dealing with the messages as they came in. I was starting to piece older details together. The perfume that seemed too fresh some days and nearly gone on others. The way Jules had insisted I didn't need to replace anything because the apartment was already set up. The fact that one of the kitchen drawers stuck unless you pulled it in a certain way, and one message from a stranger had said, "Stop leaving the drawer open," like they knew exactly which one. At the time, each piece sat by itself. Later, they started leaning toward each other. I asked Jules again whether anyone else had access. Ex-roommates, old partners, neighbors, anybody. They got defensive fast, said I was making something out of nothing, said the apartment had been theirs, not some public venue. That answer bothered me more than it should have, not because it sounded guilty exactly, because it sounded rehearsed. I didn't leave yet, I should have. Instead, I tried to understand it. That's the part I regret most. Once your brain decides a thing might be explainable, curiosity can trap you almost as well as fear. I started saving screenshots, writing down times, comparing battery heat to sent timestamps. I slept with my phone face down but woke up checking it before my eyes had fully focused. The city noise outside stopped comforting me because it made the apartment feel less separate, less protected. Anybody could be under those windows. Anybody could be in the parking lot looking up. A week after the first message, I got one reply that changed the whole shape of it. Nice lamp, still leaning left. I looked at the lamp on my nightstand. It was cheap brass and the shade had a dent on one side, so it did lean slightly toward the wall. Nobody had seen that over video call. I hadn't posted it anywhere. It was just in my bedroom, next to the bed. Visible if you were standing near the closet or sitting low by the door. I left the apartment for the night and stayed in my car in a grocery store parking lot until dawn because I couldn't make myself go back in and also couldn't bring myself to call the police and explain messages about a leaning lamp. The next morning I returned in sunlight with coffee in one hand and the absurd hope that daylight would make everything stupid again. Inside, the apartment smelled stale, sweet, closed up. Nothing moved, no signs of entry. I checked windows, locks, vents, closet, under the bed. I even looked behind the shower curtain, which made me feel like I was in a scene from somebody else's life. My phone buzzed while I was standing in the bedroom. A reply from another unknown number. "You took the blue blanket to the couch this time." I looked down. I was holding the edge of the blue knit blanket in my left hand without realizing it. I think that was the moment my body understood before my mind did. My hand started shaking so badly the phone tapped against my rings. My mouth tasted metallic. I left the apartment again and went straight to a phone repair place because I desperately wanted a man in a polo shirt to tell me there was a technical reason for all of it. He checked for malware, looked through my settings, shrugged, and said he didn't see anything weird except maybe some old restored threads. He told me a factory reset would probably clear it up. I did the reset that afternoon in the library because I didn't want to sit alone in the apartment while it restarted. When it came back on, there were no messages. Clean slate, new relief, real relief. I even cried a little in one of the library bathroom stalls because the release of it made my legs feel shaky. Then that night, just after 11, a single message came in from an unsaved number. Much better. Now open the photos. I don't know why I did it. I think because by then responding or not responding both felt like choices that mattered and I didn't know which one made me safer. So I opened photos. There, in recent images, was a picture I had never taken. My bedroom from the far corner near the closet angled down toward the bed. The lamp leaning left, the blue blanket thrown across the mattress, my backpack on the floor. It wasn't an old picture. I could tell because the book on the nightstand was one I'd bought 3 days earlier and hadn't brought anywhere else. The shot was steady, chest height, like whoever took it had time. I dropped the phone. I actually dropped it. It hit the rug and bounced once. The whole room seemed to tilt. I could hear my pulse in my ears, fast and blunt, and I kept looking toward the closet, because that was roughly where the image had been taken from, like something might still be, standing there if I looked quickly enough. Another message came in while the phone was on the floor. I liked it better when Jules answered. That name in that moment did something ugly to every memory that came before it, not just the apartment. The way Jules had insisted the place would be easier for both of us. The leftover mail in the drawer, the defensive tone, the perfume that wasn't gone. I don't know whether the sender was Jules or somebody Jules had been talking to or somebody who'd had access long before I got there. I still don't. But once I saw that line, every earlier detail stopped being random and started belonging to the same thing. I shoved clothes into a duffel without folding them. My charger, wallet, laptop, whatever I could grab in under 2 minutes. I left dishes in the sink, left one shoe under the bed and didn't go back for it. Left the blue blanket on the floor where the phone had landed. I took the stairs too fast. Nearly slipped on the second-floor landing, got into my car and drove to my sister's place in Round Rock without checking my mirrors as much as I should have. I stopped using that phone the same night. I turned it off at a gas station and wrapped it in a sweatshirt in my trunk like it might somehow keep talking if I left it in the front seat. The next morning my sister helped me get a new device and a new number. I blocked Jules everywhere before they could explain. They did try. Email, social media, one voicemail from a work number that I deleted halfway through because hearing their voice made my shoulders go hard. I moved the rest of my stuff out a week later with my sister and her boyfriend beside me the whole time. In daylight, in a rush, saying almost nothing. The apartment looked small and ordinary and used up. That was somehow worse. I still go back through the timeline in my head more than I want to, not because I think I'll solve it, but because there were so many moments that were only scary after the fact. The warm phone, the perfume that never fully faded, the message about the drawer, the way the photo angle matched a part of the room I never stood in. Retroactive fear is a gross thing. It's like having your past edited after you've already lived it. The question that hasn't loosened its grip is who kept those conversations going after I stopped completely. My old number continued showing as active to one friend for days after I powered the phone down. She got one message from it that just said, "She won't answer from the bedroom anymore." Not my style of writing. Not even close. The carrier said the line had been deactivated properly. Jules swore they had nothing to do with it, which stopped meaning anything by then. I don't use smart home stuff now. No voice assistants, no shared accounts if I can help it. Nothing that makes my life easier by being connected to 10 other invisible things. I also can't set a phone down in a room and walk away from it without feeling a small drag of panic in my chest. I know how that sounds. I know plenty of this sounds thin if you weren't the one holding the device when it warmed up by itself. But once you've seen a picture of your own bedroom taken from inside it, all your old explanations start feeling like something somebody handed you to keep you still. I changed numbers, changed phones, changed apartments, and I still get the urge sometimes to open old message threads and check whether there are gaps in them, places where a conversation could have kept going without me. I never do. I don't want to see my own name coming from my own number again. The next story is different on the surface. Older people, contracts instead of texts, a business instead of a bedroom. But it's the same terrible lesson in a cleaner outfit. Once somebody learns the shape of your identity, they don't always need your permission to keep using it. Story 3. The business we didn't share. The worst part wasn't finding my signature where it shouldn't have been. The worst part was watching other people treat it as ordinary. That's what stripped the ground out from under me. A forged name on one document is a problem. A forged name distributed across emails, invoices, vendor calls, and legal agreements until it becomes a version of reality other people are already living inside. That's something else. By the time I understood I wasn't dealing with sloppiness, the machinery had been turning for months, maybe longer, and most of it had done so quietly enough that I was still showing up to the office thinking I was handling an orderly separation. My name is Dev Malik. I was 42 when this happened, and I was still co-managing the administrative side of a small event logistics company in Chicago with my ex, Laurel, because ending a relationship turns out to be easier than unwinding a business. Our office was on the second floor of a narrow brick building in West Town above a wholesale bakery. Every morning the hall smelled like paper, toner, stale coffee from our break counter, and whatever sweet thing the bakery had started at dawn downstairs. The fluorescent lights in the main room gave off a low electrical hum that disappeared after 10 minutes if you were used to it. I was used to it. I handled vendor contracts, payroll approvals, insurance renewals, and the final accounting we needed to divide assets cleanly. Laurel took client-facing work and scheduling. That was the agreement. Dry, practical, adult. I was professionally alone a lot in those weeks, which suited me. I got in early, unlocked the office on Damon, turned on the copier, checked the inbox, and worked through stacks of files while the city outside was still graying into morning. The breakup had been difficult in the normal ways, but not explosive, or so I thought. We were not trying to be friends, we were trying to be efficient. Efficiency feels safe when your private life has gone sideways. The first irregularity looked like a clerical mistake. A vendor agreement for storage rentals included an approval notation beside my name on a date in late October that I didn't remember handling. We processed enough paperwork that a missed memory wasn't impossible, and the line itself was minor. Initialed by D. Malik, approved per revised rate schedule. I stared at it for a few seconds, then pulled the surrounding file. The smell of paper dust and copier heat was strong because the printer had been running all morning. I checked the digital copy, then the hard copy, then my calendar. Nothing. Still, my first response was simple. Admin error. Old template. Somebody pasted a note from another contract. I said it aloud to myself, not because I was worried, but because naming the likely explanation makes a workplace issue smaller. That's how competent people stay competent. You classify. You verify. You correct. I emailed Laurel and asked if she knew why the note was there. She responded 20 minutes later, probably from the old version. I'll have Carla fix it. Carla was our part-time bookkeeper. That answer fit neatly enough that I moved on. I remember feeling mildly annoyed at the interruption, nothing more. I had 3 insurance renewals to review and an accountant waiting on year-end figures. One bad notation did not merit a mood. The trouble was that once I saw one, I started spotting others. A catering contract in a blue folder had my signature at the bottom, but the loop on the D in Dev was too narrow. A warehouse access form had a digital approval from my email address attached, time-stamped at just after 8 on a Saturday morning when I was on the lakefront with my brother, drinking coffee from a paper cup and helping him move a dresser. Another document showed my signature in full, but the pressure pattern was wrong. I know that sounds overly precise, but I review signed paperwork for a living. There are things you notice. where someone hesitates, how the second downward stroke thickens when the pen bites the page. These signatures looked close enough to pass in normal circulation and slightly off to anybody who lived with them daily. That should have alarmed me more than it did. Instead, I treated it as an escalating documentation problem. I built category, signature inconsistency, misapplied digital approval, potential template contamination. That language gave me distance. It let me behave like a manager instead of a man whose name was moving around the office without him. I started a spreadsheet. Date, document type, discrepancy, source, likely explanation. That last column is painful to remember because of how many times I filled it with things that sound intelligent until you put them beside each other. Scan distortion, autofill from prior contract, assistant error, legacy document carried forward. I believed in systems. Systems fail in recognizable ways. I kept expecting the pattern to settle into one of those. What unsettled me first wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the files. I would leave a stack on the right side of my desk in the order I wanted to review them. Newest on top, color tabs facing out. When I came back from the kitchenette with coffee or from a call in the hall, the order would be different. Not obviously disturbed, just rearranged enough that a red tab sat where a green one should have been, or a folder I'd placed third was now fifth. The office always smelled slightly of coffee gone cool and printer toner by mid-morning, and I'd stand there with my mug in hand trying to remember if I'd done it myself while distracted. Laurel was in and out. Carla came twice a week. Our operations coordinator, Mitch, floated between offices and job sites. Plenty of innocent hands touched files. I knew that. But it began to feel like somebody was reading over my shoulder and then restacking the evidence before I could make sense of it. A few days later, a vendor from Oak Park called to confirm our conversation about revised payment timing. I hadn't had that conversation. I asked him to clarify, keeping my tone neutral. He said we'd spoken 2 days earlier. You were in the office, he told me. I could hear the train in the background on his end and the static edge of speakerphone. He said I'd mentioned Laurel being tied up, said I'd approved a staggered schedule if they sent an amended invoice. He even repeated a phrase back to me that I do use at work. Let's keep this clean on the paper trail. That phrase landing in someone else's voice made the back of my neck tighten. I checked my sent folder after the call and found the email chain. There it was, from my address. Correct signature block. Attached invoice. Brief, professional language that sounded like me in the same way a rental unit can look like home in listing photos. Similar enough to trick you, off enough that living inside it would feel wrong. I forwarded it to myself at a personal account and then called Laurel into my office. She leaned in the doorway first instead of fully entering, which annoyed me immediately. The fluorescent light flattened everything, gave her face a pale wash. I asked if she'd touched my email access. She rolled her eyes before I finished the sentence, told me no, told me I was wound too tight. Said half the office still used old device logins because the server migration was messy. That part was plausible. We had been messy about the migration. I hated that it was plausible. By the end of that week, I had 6 suspect documents, 3 email chains I didn't recall, and 2 third parties describing conversations I had not had. My sleep changed before my thoughts did. I'd wake around 4, chest already tense, and mentally walk the office floor plan as if something about imagining the file cabinets and desk drawers in the dark could keep my identity from spreading any further during the hours I wasn't there. Then came the first reveal of planning. I was reviewing archived expense folders in the back room. The one without windows where we kept old bank records and extra toner. The air in there always smelled drier than the rest of the office, dusty and overcooled. with that chalky scent cardboard gives off when it's been shut for years. I pulled down a banker box labeled Transport Q3 and found, tucked between fuel receipts, a manila envelope with my name written on it in Laurel's handwriting. Inside were photocopies of my driver's license, an older passport page, and a page of signature samples on blank paper. Some were obviously practice, some were close. One was nearly perfect. I just stood there holding them. My fingertips had gone cold, but sweat was starting under my shirt at the same time. There are moments when your body refuses to let you keep pretending, even if your mind still wants to manage it. That was one of them. This was not administrative confusion. This was preparation. I took the envelope straight to Laurel. For the first time, she looked genuinely thrown. Then, just as quickly, she shifted, sat down, exhaled, became reasonable. She said she should have told me about it earlier. Said Carla had pulled old identification documents when they were trying to update merchant processing after the breakup paperwork began. Said the practice signatures came from Mitch, who'd been testing a digital stamp program and being an idiot about it. The explanation arrived too fast, but it had names, functions, process language, enough structure to stand up for a minute. I pushed harder. Laurel called Carla in. Carla looked panicked, then embarrassed, then apologetic. She admitted she'd mishandled some document prep. Mitch was brought into the office and, with the posture of a teenager cornered at a principal's desk, claimed he'd been experimenting with a signature capture tool for remote approvals because job sites kept needing forms when I wasn't there. It sounded reckless, stupid, fireable. It also sounded solvable. This was the false resolution, though I didn't know to call it that then. Laurel apologized. Carla corrected 3 contracts in front of me. Mitch deleted the signature tool from his laptop while I watched. We changed passwords, revoked app access, notified 2 vendors of clerical corrections, and for about 10 days the world slid back into alignment. Files stayed where I left them. No mystery emails appeared. Vendors called the right line. I let my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Not fully, but enough to function like a person instead of a perimeter alarm. I even had the humiliating thought that maybe I had overreacted, that I had let the breakup poison my judgment. Paranoia loves that middle ground where you might still be the one making the room strange. Then the second layer surfaced. A finalized equipment contract landed in my inbox on a wet Thursday afternoon in February. The office windows were streaked with freezing rain, and the radiator near reception kept knocking in irregular little bursts. I almost didn't open the attachment because I assumed it was another routine closeout. When I did, I saw my signature at the bottom, full and clean, with a digital timestamp placing execution at 11:13 on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks earlier. At 11:13 that Tuesday, I had been in a deposition room at my attorney's office regarding the division of business assets. I know the time because the receptionist had brought in coffee and white paper cups at 11:10, and I spilled some on my cuff when I reached for a folder. My attorney, Nora Feld, could verify the hour. So could the security camera in the lobby, probably. There was no ambiguity. The contract itself was not minor. It committed the company to a long-term storage arrangement and reassigned liability in a way that could have dragged me deeper into the business after separation. Maybe even exposed me to debts I hadn't approved. My signature wasn't just on it. It was central. I felt my whole chest tighten, not with dramatic fear, but with that awful constricted pressure that makes your breathing go shallow and useless. I called Laurel immediately. No answer. I called Mitch. He answered, heard the tone in my voice, and started saying he thought everything had been fixed. I hung up on him. Then I tried to pull server access logs and found my permissions reduced on our own system. That detail snapped something in me more than the forged contract itself. It meant there had been another step, Another quiet adjustment while I was busy believing the problem had been contained. My hands were slick enough that I nearly dropped the mouse. I could hear the fluorescent hum, the copier whirring in the next room, the bakery downstairs running some mixer that vibrated faintly through the floorboards. The office was unbearably normal while my name was being used in it. I went straight to Nora with the contract. She took one look at the timestamp and stopped me mid-sentence. Asked for every suspect file, every screenshot, every email chain. Her calm was a relief so intense it nearly made me lightheaded. Some fears get worse when shared. This one got more solid, which was exactly what I needed. She called it what I hadn't wanted to fully call it yet. Identity misuse, potential fraud, document fabrication, possible conspiracy if others had knowledge. Hearing those words in a legal voice didn't make me feel safer. It made me realize how wide the thing might already be. Nora contacted Laurel's counsel within the hour and filed emergency notices to remove me from any pending authorizations. She told me, very plainly, not to return to the office alone. I ignored that once, the same evening, because I wanted one final thing from my desk and because controlled people often make bad choices the second they feel controlled by circumstance. The office was dim when I got there. Only the backlights on. Rain ticked against the windows. The place smelled like burnt coffee and wet wool from somebody's coat drying on a chair. My desk drawers were closed, but my top file stack was gone. Not scattered. Gone. In its place sat a single yellow legal pad with 3 words written across the top in block letters. You approved this. I don't know if Laurel wrote it. I don't know if Mitch did. I don't know if it had been left as intimidation or insistence or some warped effort to force a reality into existence by repetition. But looking at those words in my office, in a room that had held years of ordinary work, did more damage than yelling would have. It meant whoever had done this understood exactly what mattered, not just using my name, making me doubt whether I'd ever fully be able to separate myself from the version of me they had built into their paperwork. I backed out of the office and called Nora from the hall. My voice came out thinner than I wanted. She arranged for a colleague and a building security guard to meet me the next morning to retrieve the rest of my belongings. That was my exit from the business. Not dramatic, not handcuffs. A legal advisor, a neutral witness, 2 archive boxes, and a printed statement removing me from all operations pending formal action. After that, I withdrew completely. Nora handled every communication through counsel. My work laptop went into evidence review. Passwords changed again. Vendors were notified. Selectively, because saying too much can create its own kind of liability. Friends asked why I had walked away from a company I helped build, and I found myself giving bloodless answers because the real one sounded almost absurd. Somebody was wearing my professional life like a pressed shirt, and I didn't notice how often until I saw the collar was wrong. The question that still wakes me some nights is scope, not who started it, though that matters, not even how. Scope, how many agreements were finalized using my identity before I understood the pattern. How many routine renewals, small approvals, corrected versions, back-end permissions, quiet vendor acknowledgments slid through because I was busy dismissing each anomaly as the kind of administrative noise every business produces. Paranoia is exhausting because it makes you doubt the room. This was worse. The room actually was altered, and I still had to live through the part where I seemed unreasonable for noticing. I keep my signature differently now. That sounds strange, but it's true. I changed how I sign personal documents and what parts of it I let appear digitally. I also no longer leave papers unattended on a desk, even in my own house. If I get up for coffee, the file gets closed. If someone asks for a quick signed scan, they wait until I can review the full chain. These are small behaviors. Practically, but they came from something ugly and lasting. When people talk about toxic relationships, they usually mean the loud stuff. The arguments, the control you can point at. What happened to me was quieter, cooperative on the surface, professional. It used the language of process and transition and fairness until I could barely tell when it stopped being separation and became occupation. The next story strips away the paperwork and leaves only the simplest version of the same thing. A remote cabin, a locked box, a weekend with an ending you can see coming long before you can stop it. Story 4. The trip we couldn't end. By the second night, I knew the weekend wasn't about fixing anything. I knew it in the plain, humiliating way you know a thing you've been trying not to name for hours. The hard part was that knowing didn't help. We were already out there. The roads were dark. My phone signal came and went, and every hour had started getting measured against the same thought. Just make it to morning, then make it to the next one. That's how that whole trip felt in the end. Not like an argument, like a countdown. My name's Talia. I was 22, working part-time at a bookstore in Flagstaff and taking online classes when my partner Reed suggested we do a weekend away in northern Arizona to reset and actually talk without friends, work, or phones getting in the way. We'd been bad for months in a way that was easy to minimize because it wasn't dramatic every day. Some days Reed was attentive and soft-spoken and almost painfully sincere about wanting us to work. I wasn't good at being alone, and I hated looking unreasonable, so when he said maybe a quiet cabin would help, I said yes. That was voluntary. I need to be honest about that. I agreed. We left Friday afternoon and drove north on a road that got emptier and colder the farther we went. Pine trees, long stretches of pale dirt, sky going from bright to copper to flat blue-gray. By the time we reached the cabin, it was nearly dark and the air outside had that dry cold that bites the inside of your nose. The place sat by itself off a narrow road. One story, heavy front door, little porch. No other houses in sight from the windows. Inside smelled like old wood, dust, and a fireplace that had been used recently. Reed carried the bags in, smiling, acting purposeful, like this had all been planned lovingly. I wanted to meet that energy. I really did. We unpacked groceries. I put my toothbrush by the sink. We tried to act like people arriving somewhere good. The first rule came before dinner. Don't go outside after dark, Reed said like it was obvious. I asked why. He shrugged and said there were no lights. Uneven ground, maybe coyotes, maybe just no reason to wander around alone at night in a place like that. It sounded reasonable enough that I nodded. I even felt silly for bristling. Remote cabin. Unfamiliar area. Cold outside. Fine. Safety rule. That was how I filed it away. We ate pasta from a pot that took forever to boil because the stove ran hot and cold. The cabin got very quiet once the dishes were done. Not peaceful quiet. Total quiet. No city wash, no distant traffic. Not even neighbor sounds through a wall. Just the occasional creak in the wood and the faint rush of wind outside. Every time one of the doors shut, it felt heavier than it should have, like the cabin was built to seal itself. That first night, Reed added 2 more rules casual. Keep your phone charging in the kitchen so we're not scrolling in bed. And if one of us gets up during the night, wake the other. I laughed and said that was weird. He smiled back and said, we're here to reconnect. No disappearing. I should have said no right then. Instead, I thought about how I'd sound, defensive, unwilling, like I didn't care enough to try. Social fear can ruin your instincts. It makes you cooperate with things you already dislike, just to avoid becoming the difficult one in the room. Saturday morning there was coffee, eggs, cold sunlight through the small windows, and for an hour I almost convinced myself the night before had just felt intense because of the drive. Then the rules kept coming. No locking the bathroom door. No walking off while the other person is talking. Leave your bag by the couch, not in the bedroom. If we're being honest this weekend, we don't get to hide behind breaks. Reed said all of this in a calm voice while slicing an apple at the counter. Thin, precise cuts, the knife tapping the board. I remember the smell of coffee grounds and the sharp, sweet apple scent, and how my throat kept tightening each time he said rule without saying the word rule. I tried making suggestions in that careful way people do when they don't want a disagreement to become a scene. Maybe we could just have a loose plan. Maybe I'd take a short walk after lunch. Maybe I wanted a little time to think before some of the heavier conversation. Every suggestion got answered with something that sounded thoughtful and landed like a wall. A walk would interrupt momentum. Thinking alone is how you avoid the issue. We're here because avoiding things hasn't worked. By midday, I was aware of Reed watching me constantly. Not glaring, not openly threatening, just track. If I stood up, his eyes followed. If I took my phone from the kitchen counter, he'd ask who I was checking in with. If I went to the bedroom for a sweater, he found a reason to come in 30 seconds later. It was so steady that by mid-afternoon I started moving less, just to keep from triggering another conversation about what my movements meant. I asked for the car keys around 4 because I wanted something from my tote in the trunk. Reed said he had them. 10 minutes later, when I asked again, he said not to worry about it. By dinner, I knew he had hidden them. That changed the clock in my head. Up until then, leaving was still theoretical. A choice I could make if things got worse. Once the keys disappeared, the weekend had an endpoint I wasn't controlling. We were supposed to drive back Sunday afternoon. That became the deadline. Survive Saturday night. Survive Sunday morning. Don't make it worse. Get home. End it there. I checked my phone in the bathroom after dinner and saw 1 bar of service flicker to none, then back again. I texted my friend Noah just casually, "Hey, at cabin with Reed, service is bad, talk tomorrow." The message didn't send. I tried again by the front window. Nothing. When I turned around, Reed was standing in the hallway. "You don't need to report in every 5 minutes," he said. I told him I was just letting a friend know service was spotty. My voice sounded too bright, too polite, like I was smoothing something with my hand. He nodded slowly and said, "This is what I mean. You're always halfway somewhere else." Saturday night felt longer than it was. The fire popped. The dry air made my lips crack. Reed wanted to talk through every grievance in looping detail while also controlling where I sat, when I spoke, when I went quiet. Once, when I stood up to refill my water, he said, "Sit down, we're not done." Not loudly. That almost made it worse. The cabin was so silent outside that his calm voice seemed to press against the wall. I slept badly and kept waking to the sound of nothing. That's a real sound in places like that. Nothing outside, nothing in the next room, just your own blood moving too fast and the small ticks of a building settling into cold. At some point before dawn, I realized Reed had put his arm across the bed, not affectionately, but like a bar. Sunday morning, the deadline got close enough to taste. Reed acted lighter, almost cheerful, which unsettled me more than the night before. He made coffee, opened the curtain, talked about breakfast sandwiches on the drive home, as if we had successfully worked through something. I played along because the clock in my head said a few more hours, just a few more. My chest hurt from holding myself so carefully. I felt my pulse in my throat every time he left the room because I wanted to search for the keys and was terrified he'd catch me doing it. Just before noon, he went outside to bring in more wood from the side of the cabin. I searched then. Jacket pockets, kitchen drawer, under the couch cushions, top shelf by the door, bathroom cabinet, our bags. My hands were clumsy from adrenaline. I kept dropping things and having to stop to listen. Every second felt expensive. Then in the bedroom closet under an extra blanket I found a small metal lockbox, plain gray, about the size of a lunch container, combination dial on the front. I knew before I shook it what would be inside. The weight told me. A dense little clink, then another. The keys. I twisted the dial anyway with the obvious numbers first. Reed's birthday. Mine. The year we started dating. Nothing. My fingertips were slick against the metal. My breathing got too fast and shallow, and the closet smelled like cedar and cold fabric and my own stress sweat. Outside, I heard the front door open and close. Reed was back. I shoved the lockbox under the blanket just as he stepped into the hall. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Looking for my sweater," I said, and hated how quickly I said it. He watched me for a second too long, then smiled in this small, tired way and leaned against the frame. "We're not leaving until everything's fixed," he said. That's the exact sentence. I remember every word because of how gently he said it, not yelling, not bargaining, just stating it, like weather. I asked what that meant. He said, "You know what it means." I said I wanted to go home. He said, "Home is where you keep doing this." That was the peak for me, not because it was physically violent, but because the structure of the weekend finally became undeniable. The hidden keys weren't impulsive. The rules weren't situational. Each one had tested what I'd accept. No going outside, no phone in the bedroom, no locked doors, no keys, no movement without explanation. It had escalated one manageable step at a time until leaving required his permission. I thought about running anyway. Dirt road, no keys, weak signal, miles to anything I knew. I thought about grabbing my bag and forcing the issue. But Reed was between me and the front of the cabin, and my body had that horrible, light, unstable feeling you get when fear has been stacking for too long with nowhere to go. My hands were tingling. My chest felt tight and hollow at once. I knew if I challenged him directly then, in that room with no clear way out, I'd be gambling on what he would do when the performance of calm finally cracked. So I did the thing I hate admitting. I endured it. I nodded like I understood. I sat back down. I let him talk through lunch, through the early afternoon, through the long, slow return of the idea that we were making progress. I gave him neutral sounds. I softened my face. I acted tired and thoughtful and agreeable. I performed resolution because it was the only tool I had left. By the time we finally got into the car later that day, after Reed announced we could head back because we'd both done the work, my whole body ached from how tightly I had held myself together. The drive home felt unreal. Same road, same trees, same sky opening wider as we neared town. But now every mile marker was proof I had not imagined any of it. Reed talked occasionally. Casual, reflective, even affectionate. I answered just enough to keep everything level. The car keys were back in the console, visible. That detail made me feel sick. When I got home, I waited until the next day to end it. Not because I wasn't sure. Because I needed one full night in my own room with my own lock and my own door before I could trust my voice to stay steady. I broke up with him in a coffee shop with people around and an exit close by. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded like he had expected this particular chapter of the weekend to continue. I got out. But I never got the clean ending people imagine. There was no one dramatic moment to point at for friends who wanted one. There was just a series of restrictions that formed a cage by degrees. Then a ride home where I had to act like the cage had been therapeutic. For a long time after that, I couldn't enjoy trips with anyone. A rented space, a shared itinerary, somebody else holding the keys for convenience. All of it made my shoulders tighten before I even understood why. What still unsettles me is the continuation of it. Reed still sends messages sometimes from changing numbers. Not often enough to report usefully, just enough to keep the shape of that weekend alive. Things like, "You always slept lighter there," or "The box was under the blanket because I knew you'd look," or once, "Late at night, we're still not done talking about Sunday." The phrasing is what gets me. As if the cabin wasn't a place we left, but a room in time he can step back into whenever he wants. I don't go to remote places with partners now. That sounds dramatic until you realize how ordinary a boundary can look from the outside, and how expensive it was to earn on the inside. I also won't let anybody else hold my keys, not for a minute, not to move my car, not to grab something from the trunk. If I hand them over even briefly, my chest starts to tighten before my brain catches up. The last story isn't about a current relationship at all. It's about letters, age, memory, and the way something old can keep learning your voice long after you think it's gone quiet. Maybe that's why these stories belong together. The location changes, the medium changes, but the core never does. Somebody decides your private self is material they can keep working with, and the horror isn't just what they do. It's how long it takes you to understand they never considered you finished. Story 5, The Letters That Changed Tone. I thought I understood what I was looking at when I opened the box. Old letters, old life, old mistake. That was the framework, and for the first half of this story I stayed inside it very comfortably. Memory is patchy. People change. Handwriting shifts over decades. Those were all workable explanations. What I was not prepared for was the possibility that the explanation itself was the trap. That the more I investigated, the less certain I became not only about the letters, but about what part of my own voice had always been mine. My name is Owen Mercer. I'm 61, retired from teaching, and I live alone in a narrow row house in Boston with a small upstairs study that faces the alley and gets good morning light. I am comfortable alone in the way people become comfortable with anything repeated over years. My routine is ordinary. Tea at 7, paper in the kitchen, then an hour upstairs sorting, reading, or pretending to sort things I should have thrown away sooner. This happened in late autumn, when the radiator had just started clanking again and the study smelled of old paper, dry wood, and the faint mineral odor of dust warmed by heat. On the shelf beside the desk sat a box of correspondence from a relationship that ended decades earlier, back when letters still carried the daily texture of people. I was decluttering. That was the reason. No nostalgia project. No grand emotional archaeology. Just age and shelves and the practical need to make room. The former partner in question was named Lena Hartwell. Not the first Lena in my life, but the one attached to these letters. We wrote each other through graduate school and after on cream stationery sometimes, lined paper more often, the occasional postcard tucked among longer envelopes. I remembered the broad shape of that relationship clearly enough. Smart, intense, not built to last. I also remembered my own writing habits from that time. Dense paragraphs. Certain turns of phrase. A tendency toward over-earnestness I no longer enjoy revisiting. The first wrong note was mild. One letter in my own handwriting contained a phrase I didn't recognize as mine. Not impossible, merely off. It said, "I keep catching the room practicing me." I stopped there and read the sentence twice, then a third time. The handwriting looked like mine from that era. Same slant, same crowded margin on the left, same tendency to close eights carelessly. I assumed the simplest thing. I had forgotten writing it. Decades had passed. If you put enough years between a person and his younger self, nearly any sentence can begin to feel authored by a cousin. Still, I was curious. That is my denial profile, if you like. I do not dismiss anomalies, I lean toward them. I investigate. So I made 2 piles on the desk beneath the ticking wall clock. Familiar and uncertain. The paper felt dry and slightly rough at the edges, and some envelopes gave off that vanilla-like scent very old paper gets when the fibers start to break down. Outside, somewhere in the alley, a delivery truck backed up with a soft electronic beep. Everything in the room was calm, ordinary, contained. The second letter in the uncertain pile mentioned an argument in Providence that never happened, not a misremembered detail. An entire evening I know I did not live, a train delayed by weather, a restaurant with blue tile walls, Lena crying in a taxi because of something I supposedly said about permanent. I sat back in my chair and tried to retrieve it honestly without forcing. Nothing. No impression, no blur, not even the uncertain sensation of a memory half lost. The letter was intimate in the banal way real letters are, full of side details nobody invents for effect. That made it harder to dismiss and easier to question, which is a difficult combination. I told myself 3 things in quick succession. First, I may have conflated 2 different trips over the years. Second, I may have drafted letters unsent and forgotten. Third, the archives in any long relationship are never as orderly as we imagine. Those were my working explanations. Reasonable, investigative, open-ended. Then I noticed the ink. Some of the letters that should have been 40 years old looked fresher than others. Not wet, not absurdly new, just darker. Less browned with less feathering into the paper. I took one to the window and turned it toward the light. The strokes held a gloss in places that old fountain pen ink usually loses. I felt a strange, low discomfort then. Not fear exactly. Wrongness. Like hearing a familiar song played half a note flat. That evening, instead of stopping, I went looking for comparison. Old teaching notes. A legal pad from 10 years earlier. Birthday cards I'd written. My journals from my 30s, which are far less interesting than I hoped they might be and far more useful for this purpose. I spread samples across the desk and began examining slants, loops, spacing. How I crossed my T's in different decades. The study grew dim around me. The ticking clock got louder. My tea went cold and developed that skin it gets when forgotten. Investigation can feel productive even when it's pulling you somewhere unpleasant. That is how it delayed me. By the second day, I had identified a pattern. There were multiple letters in my handwriting that were not quite right in consistent ways. Early ones missed my spacing rhythm. Mid-sequence letters got the rhythm closer, but overused phrases I only employed in speech, not writing. A few later letters captured my handwriting so accurately that the differences lived almost entirely in tone, not vocabulary. Tone, the emotional pressure in the sentences, the choice to linger one beat too long in a line, the way affection sharpened into possession without announcing itself. Another letter referenced a snowstorm blackout in an apartment I never lived in. Another spoke about a scar on my wrist I do have, but explained it with a story that isn't true. These were not simply fabricated memories. They were near versions of me, arranged beside reality closely enough that I kept feeling the urge to step between them and compare edges. At that point, I still believed I understood the situation. Some combination of drafts, copies, possibly letters Lena imitated back to me. Perhaps even an old exercise in mutual mimicry I had forgotten.